And now we're going to take a look at our displacement mapping options. And I just have a default scene where I've just added a sphere, and we're going to use this for our displacement mapping. So I'm going to double click on our surface, open up the Advanced Material Editor. We're going to go to our Bumps tab, and now what we want to do is create our bump map. So I'm going to edit our function, just move those other nodes out of the way, select our bump output node, and we can add a fractal. We can change our wavelength to about 0.2. We're using Perlin noise gradient. Let's change this to something else. We can go through, let's go through some math patterns. We're going to select spiral and click OK. And now if we take a look, we just have this basic bump map on here, but it's not actually changing the shape of our sphere. And that's what we want to do. So we're going to turn on displacement mapping, and we can already see the preview showing up of how it's affecting our sphere. If we take a look at the actual preview of the main camera, we're not going to notice any change because that preview will not render within our small preview. So we'll take a look at our render options, and I'm just going to set this to 320 by 240, final render, to screen, and just render that out. And with that finished render, we can see all of our geometry being changed, and this is all based on that specific bump map we created. Now, because we're using a spiral with object parametric and not on a spherical, it's going to look a little bit different. So let's try a different function or a different noise setting. We can do Voronoi, click OK, and now we can see that preview showing up. And let's go ahead and render that just a little bit larger, 640 by 480, and click Render. And now we can see a really cool looking object. And we can see all of this definition in here, and it basically is changing the geometry of our sphere along with whatever our bump map is set at. Now this setting will not work with absolutely every type of surface or object. This will not work with plants, so you will not be able to change and use displacement mapping on the bark of a tree or on the leaves because it will not show up correctly, and most of the time it just won't render. And if we take a look at some of our other settings, you can see we have an overall quality boost. Now the more we increase this, the longer it is going to take to calculate frames and render them. So you want to make sure that you have this value set to something reasonable. Most of the time the default setting will look okay, but if you do need to go up higher, keep in mind it will raise your render times and the amount of time it takes to calculate each frame before it actually starts rendering. Now underneath that we have a force extension setting, which allows us to move the overall bump that we've created beyond the initial surface. So if we turn on force extension, we can actually raise this value up, and what we'll do is increase the amount of extension and basically how far out our bumps are being created. I'm just going to go ahead and turn that off. And if we take a look at our next three options, we have show bumps on saturating displacements. This is very important if you are working with surfaces that, in this case, if we take a look, we have very white areas. Now if this was turned off, we might notice that in some cases, we can take a look, we can see we have some very flat areas on our preview. When show bumps on saturating displacements is on, then we lose all of that flattened area where we're going beyond what the actual map that we've created is set to. So if you want everything to be clamped off and you have a smooth surface on those very white areas, if that's what you're looking for, then you want to make sure this option's turned off. If you have ecosystems applied directly to a displacement map material, you can have move ecosystem instances turned on, which will automatically move all of your ecosystem objects to fit with your displacement map. And that's a really cool option to have. Our next is displace outward only. When we're using our displacement map, we have our white areas being the furthest amount and the largest amount of displacement, and the black areas being the least. Well, when this option is turned off, those black areas will start to go inside of our surface. Now, if we only want to go outside of our surface and not go into it at all, so we want to be basically expanding beyond what our object is, then we want to have displaced outward only turned off. Otherwise, you're going to want to have that turned on, and you won't be having your bump go into your material at all, or into your actual object in its original size. And you can see the option there with the preview changes. Pretty much that's fairly straightforward. And our last option is add to underlying layer bumps. This is only available if you have multiple surfaces. So let's go ahead and add another layer. We'll just add the gray clumps and click OK. And we want to move those gray clumps down so we have our default on top. And now we can see under our bumps that we have add to underlying layer bumps activated. And this is choosing whether or not we'd like to replace or add to the bumps underneath. Because we can see that with displacement mapping on for our underlying material, these bumps are also going to be showing up. So do we want to replace them or add on top of them? And we could just add to them if we want by increasing this percentage. And this will only be made available if it is not the lowest material on the list. You can see with the lowest material, we don't see that option because there's no need for it because we don't have to blend to anything. So there's quite a lot we can do with the displacement mapping. We could apply this directly to standard terrains if we wanted to, or even procedural terrains. Keep in mind, if you're applying this to a rather large terrain with a lot of different definition, it is going to take a long time to render. So sometimes just using a standard procedural terrain will work better than using a standard terrain with displacement mapping. But it really depends on which settings you have and what type of terrain you're working on, because those render settings can vary quite a bit depending on the type of surface you have. And we're going to take a quick look at the backlight option in the Effects tab of the Advanced Material Editor. What I want to do is just load in one of our trees. And let's just load in our plum tree again. And we want to mainly take a look at the leaves. So let's just get underneath them a little, and we can take a look at the overall lighting. Now if we switch to our leaves layer and open up the Advanced Material Editor, go to the Effects tab, we can see that our backlight is currently set to 100%. If I remove that backlight, set it down to 0%, and now we take a look at the updated preview, we can see that our leaves have gone a lot darker and they're extremely shadowed. Basically what the backlight does is gives us the illusion of translucency on thinner types of surfaces. So since a leaf is just a single-sided polygon, basically, of course manipulated in different ways to make the leaves appear certain shapes, it is thin enough that the backlight feature will be available, and we can easily adjust that amount. You can see as we move to the lower amounts, our tree really becomes very dark on a lot of our leaves unless we're looking at it directly from above. So with the underneath value, where leaves really do have a bit of translucency to them, this backlight feature will allow you to sort of fake that, and that way we can have a much lighter amount underneath the trees. Now we're going to take a look at using dispersion. So I just have our default sky and atmosphere loaded in. And what I'm going to do is just add in a pyramid shape. And we're just going to position this, move it up a little. I'm also going to give us a little bit of rotation and a couple of different axes. And that's because we need to create the simulation in the actual way this would need to be positioned adjacent to a sun in order to actually create our dispersion effects. Okay, so what I want to do is just load in, we can just load in a preset material for this. And I'm just going to select one of our glasses, and we can select our standard glass and click OK. Now one thing we want to do is go up to our render options and make sure that Compute Physically Accurate Caustics is on, because if it's not on, then we won't be able to use dispersion. And we notice it's a little bit darker in our scene now, or our actual object. And we want to go into our Advanced Material Editor, and under Transparency, we're going to turn on Enable Dispersion. I'm also going to increase this to a much larger amount. And now we really don't see anything going on right now, but that's because of the way our light is positioned, so I'm going to have to adjust our sun to fit correctly. But one thing I'm going to do is just add a little bit of a reflection, and under Effects, we want to make sure that Color Reflected Light is on just a little, and Color Transmitted Light is on all the way, since we're working with a transparent surface. And now we can sort of see some of our rainbow showing up of our dispersion along the bottom, just below our object. And if we go to the Atmosphere Editor, and under the Sun tab, what we can do is adjust the azimuth and the pitch to get to the correct position where we're going to be able to actually see that little rainbow. And we can see just that little bit of a change, we can already start to see the dispersion showing up, and that nice bit of extra caustics. So we can move that a little bit more, and now we can see it from a light of a different direction. We can adjust the pitch and bring it down just a little, bringing down our sun, and now we can see those colors much more brighter, and lots of it on the ground and also reflecting within our actual material itself. So we got some really neat options that way. And it's quite easy to just use dispersion and make some really neat looking scenes. The only thing you really got to make sure you pay attention to is exactly where the sun is at. And because it won't always create the rainbow if you're at specific directions. And we can see right now with the azimuth at 0%, we really don't see anything showing up. And that's because of the position of our light in relation to the way our object is turned. But as we move this around, we can take a look at the light coming through and create some pretty neat looking effects. Raise our pitch up a little. We can start to change the angle, and now we can see a lot more of that dispersion on the bottom. And we've just got some really neat looking rainbow effects from that. And we can see that as well on the bottom. And every shape you're using is going to create different types of dispersion and different types of rainbows. I'm just going to move this so we can see a little bit more, and click OK. And we're going to change this current pyramid to another shape. Right mouse click, go to Replace by Fit Object, and we're going to select Sphere. And now with our sphere we see an entirely different type of pattern. And looking through our surface we can see that. That's really neat looking. Let's go ahead and change that to something else. I'll change that to a torus. And now we can just see that just a tiny little bit on the inside. So there's really a lot we can do with it. And it's fairly straightforward. The settings are really don't need to be manipulated that much. We can adjust the overall dispersion amount, but other than that, there's really not much that really needs to be changed, because it looks good from pretty much any angle we can set, just as long as it is showing through. And if you just want to adjust the intensity of that, all you got to do is just go back to the setting we were just looking at for dispersion, and you can turn that down a little. And to take a look at our transparency flare settings, I've just created a small scene where all I really have is just a plane in front of our sun. And if we take a look in our 4 viewports, we can just see the camera just underneath that plane, and then the sun just going through that. So let's take a look at the surface now, and all I really have set up is a refraction index of 1.3 and a global transparency of 100%. And that's basically all I've set. It's basically a default material, and we can see the default color in there. But if we go to our transparency options, we're going to take a look at flare now, and currently our intensity and span are set to 0. If we take a look at our render, we really don't notice a lot of glow. If we increase our intensity, we really don't see a whole lot, so we need to adjust our span with that. And now we can see this polygon and this plane start to lighten up. So we can increase that a little bit more, and now we really start to see that sun and the light starting to really illuminate this object. So the more we adjust our intensity and span, the more overall effect we're going to see of that glow through this transparent object. And if I reduce our intensity, really don't see a whole lot. And basically our span is going to be how large the overall flare is, and then the intensity is our actual amount and the opacity value of that largest amount of intensity, which would be basically white. So we can see in these sort of cases where we're looking maybe up through some glass up at the sun, we would need to adjust these specific flare settings just to compensate for that overall glow we might see.